called The Master Game. And it was written, it's called The Master Game Beyond the Drug Experience. And this was written in the late 60s. So it was around the time when the psychedelic reality just hit the fan. And so he speaks about that in the book. It's interesting that he is a biochemist, and he wrote books about drugs in the mind and different other areas of mental illness and biochemistry of the brain and so forth. But this book, when I went back and looked at the topics of the chapters, it was really interesting to me how this guy had really nailed it in terms of, where things were at that time in regard to psychology and spiritualism and spirituality. And in the book, he calls a way of approaching awakening creative psychology. There was no terms for it back then. This is in the late 60s. It was just around the time when the humanistic movement was just beginning, and the humanistic movement was a movement in psychology that was attracted to Eastern thought. Transpersonal psychology came into existence somewhere around that time, and transpersonal psychology really was a form of psychology that was using spiritual ideas to treat people, with the idea that they could transform using spiritual ideas. It never really caught on. Transpersonal psychology never became a really popular approach to doing treatment. But I was looking at some of the writing in the book, and it was kind of interesting the way he talks about things, because one of the things that he points out in the book is that while psychedelics may give you a visit, so to speak, to this awakened state, that it's not going to last, and it can have side effects, in the sense that for somebody who doesn't understand a lot of these experiences, it could be pretty dramatic, and it could really create a contrast between the awakened state and whatever condition the person was in before they took the LSD. And if they're very much, if that particular person was kind of neurotic, which is common, and really connected a lot to the worldly reality, it could create a lot of disturbance, because now all of a sudden you're in a dramatically completely different world, and it's very appealing in many ways, right? And then all of a sudden you're back in this little limited world again, and you can't do anything to get back to the experience that you were having under LSD. This was one of the things that back in the day, when Timothy Leary and Ram Dass, who was Richard Alberts at the time, when they were Harvard psychologists, LSD was very new, and so the people that were experimenting with it and experiencing this expanded state of consciousness were really interested in whether or not the drug could actually get you into that state, and you can actually stay in that state, that it could be a permanent shift that occurs. Well, they found out that wasn't the case. In fact, Ram Dass and a bunch of other friends of his went to an estate. I believe it was an estate that his father owned. His father was at the head of a railroad. He was fairly wealthy. And they went to this estate, and they were like taking huge doses of LSD over and over again. And what they were trying to do is to see if they could stay in that awareness. And they kept coming down. And then they also noticed that there was a tolerance effect, that the more times they took it, the less stronger the experience was. And they had to take more all the time. So they realized that it wasn't going to work. And that's when Ram Dass ended up going to India and getting a guru and getting his spiritual name. And Leary didn't do that. Leary just decided he was going to keep taking LSD the rest of his life. And he started this turn on, drop out thing, you know. The government didn't appreciate that and arrested him. So, anyway, so that's the story there. But so a couple of things in the book that I noticed when I was paging through that are really kind of useful and interesting in relationship to the conversations that we have here. For example, in one place he says, "Only by work, by a steady, unremitting effort, can a person learn to stop the wheel of imagination, to halt that flood of inner conversations, arguments, mere chatter, to halt that flood of inner conversations, arguments, and mere chatter with which the brain, by its useless overactivity, floods the awareness from dawn to dusk." So you can see how that's very consistent with the conversations that we've been having here and the conversations that have been had about that since then. Then he goes on to say, while this noise persists, no deep awareness is possible. Why this noise, and he's talking about thinking. Why this noise persists, no deep awareness is possible. So for one who really wishes to practice, the first rule is very simple. Enter the silence as often as possible, remain there as long as possible. And the silence is meditation. Enter the silence as often as possible and remain there as long as possible. And then he says, stop thoughts. I don't know if stop thoughts is the clearest way to say that, because, you know, stopping thoughts is not possible. But what he's alluding to when he says stop thoughts is he's really saying move your attention away from thinking. And that amounts to the same thing, because if your attention is not on thinking, there are no thoughts, right? Because you're not paying attention to thinking, right? So that was one thing that caught my attention that I thought was very interesting because of how consistent it was and is with the conversations we're having these days about the same thing. Then there's another place in the book that caught my attention. The whole book is actually good. By the way, I don't even know if it's available anymore. The author's name is Robert D. Roth. This is what the title of the book looks like. It was pretty popular back then. It was a pretty popular book back then. And I'm sure he's not even alive anymore at this point. And another place in the book, it talks about awareness and attention. And he says the practice of simple awareness is impossible without control of attention. Attention is to awareness as the oil in a lamp is to its flame. That's an interesting metaphor. Attention is to awareness as the oil is to a lamp is to its flame. In other words, without attention, attention is the fuel. Without attention, you can't pay attention. Without attention, you can't be aware of what's going on without attention, right? So attention is, you know, the father of psychology, William James, said attention is maybe the most important concept of all concepts, attention. And so he goes on to say here, control of attention is the one function that man possesses which may be said to confer on him a certain amount of free will. He can direct his attention, has that freedom, but his power to do this depends upon his possessing a certain kind of energy, the supply of which is limited. Each day on awakening, he has just so much of this energy, as a battery, after being charged, contains so much electrical potential. His inner work each day depends on the conservation of this energy. Once it has been squandered, it is hard to replace. So he's talking about the conservation of energy here, and this is one of the reasons why the gurus and the yogis in India were so interested in the breath and so interested in the diet, right? And so interested in yoga exercises, right? Because energy is necessary for consciousness. Energy is necessary for consciousness. If you burn up a lot of the energy available to you in thinking, you're depleting the battery. You're depleting the energy that's available for consciousness. And the less energy you have available for consciousness, the harder it is to stay conscious. A simple example of that would be if you're tired, right? If you were really tired right now, right, and you were sitting here and we're talking about this stuff, this stuff isn't easy to get when you're completely awake. So if you're really tired when we're talking about this stuff, you're just out of it. You're not going to be able to get it, right? Same thing is true with meditation. If you're really tired when you go to practice meditation, you'll have difficulty. You'll keep falling asleep. So energy is a factor. Energy is a factor. And this becomes a reason why it's important for us, especially as you progress and learn more, right? Because you want to continue with this evolutionary process of waking up, right? So you can come out of the dream. If you understand the implications of the condition that we find ourselves in, then you are committed to doing whatever you can to get out of it. And in order to get out of it, you're going to have to pay attention to energy, which means you're going to have to pay attention to diet, right? Because where do you get your energy? You get your energy from the food you eat, right? Again, this is one of the reasons why people who are very interested in spiritual evolution pay a lot of attention to what they eat. They pay a lot of attention to what they eat. They pay a lot of attention to sleep, getting proper rest, right? They pay a lot of attention to taking care of the physical body, getting physical exercise, and so forth and so on. It really became clear to me recently that I used to think about the body as kind of an aside. You know what I mean? When it comes to spirituality, it's a non-physical thing, right? So I used to think of the body as an aside. Recently, it became evident to me that's a mistake. It's a mistake. The body, the mind-body organism has to synchronize with the consciousness in order for this to work. You can't have a body that's sleeping. You can't have a body that's in a state of dis-ease. You can't have a body that is suffering from tension, right? Or suffering from the effects of tension in the body, which means conditions like migraines or difficulty digesting or asthma, all the kinds of things that are related to stress, right? You can't have all that going on physically and think that you're just going to spiritually transcend all that stuff. No. If you come to understand this, it means that you have to give attention to the body. You've got to take care of the body. You've got to train your body to relax. This is so critical. If you can't train your body to relax in the same way that we're talking about, the mind must calm down, right? The mind's got to calm down. There's got to be more space there. There's got to be more quiet there. The same thing is true with the body. The body's got to calm down. The body's got to relax. We've got to pay attention to the tension in the body so it can release. And this has to be as consistent a practice as you're practicing the other aspects of meditation. It's got to be a consistent practice as that. And the consistency with dealing with the body has the same effect as the consistency with dealing with the mind and dealing with consciousness, right? If you exercise the biggest problem with people taking care of the body and the mind is the same problem that people have in terms of taking care of the consciousness. No consistency. No consistency. People go on diets and then gain the weight back, right? People exercise and then quit the gym. So this is commonly the way people are, right? They get in this thing where they're going to join the gym and exercise, and they go for a little while and then they stop, right? So usually by the fall, 50% of the membership here stops coming, so the rest of us get to have more space. That's the way it is in especially places like this, If you get to higher class gyms and all that, people are more diligent in those places. So the tip today is give some attention to your body. Give some attention to your sleep patterns. If you're not sleeping well, right, start to pay attention to that and start to look at what you can do to change it. What do you need to do to get better sleep? More exercise will help you to sleep better. You want to tire the body out, right? The other thing that you can do to get more sleep is calm the mind. If the mind calms down, the body will follow. The body-mind is interactive, right? So if the mind calms down, the body will follow. And then the other thing that we're paying attention to in terms of reducing stress on the body, right, is looking at your life and to see how much stress is in your life. How much stress are you carrying related to your life? What is the circumstances of your life that's producing stress, right? If you're I remember back in the day, I had a client that worked on Wall Street, right? And it was very difficult to work with him and do psychotherapy because he couldn't give up how much he was drinking and how much drugs he was taking while he was working on Wall Street every day. So that's what I was dealing with all the time. It was impossible to do psychotherapy because by the time he came home at night, he was just coming down from being high all day and drinking, right? So it's important to really understand that you can't succeed past a certain point, right, in waking up without including the body. You can't succeed. And if you do include the body, and then you haven't been including the body, and you do include the body, you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see that your meditation gets better. You'll see that the overall quality of your spiritual life increases. You'll see that there is an experience of being embodied in the body that's energetic, that's part of consciousness. So it's very important. So, he also in this book, apparently he was a big Gurdjieff student of George Gurdjieff, and I've talked about Gurdjieff here. And he was a kind of a spiritualist teacher in the 1900s that was known around the world for a specific approach that he developed to help people wake up. So I just thought that was an interesting thing, and I thought I'd share a little bit about it because one of the things that I have found to be important is you do the work, you learn about spirituality, you learn it from the teachings, you learn about the practices, and then you do the work, you do the practices, you develop insight, you look and you see these things for yourself. And as you do the work, it's important from time to time to go back and check yourself, listen to some good teachers, look at some of the better books that are around and see, is the work you're doing valid? Or is the work you're doing consistent with what the teachings are saying, right? So you can stay on track. Otherwise, it's easy to go off, you can people go off in these weird things, like cults and crazy drug stuff and, all kinds of other things. So you want to keep yourself grounded, you want to keep yourself connected to a spiritual community that you trust. So you know what you're doing. And so you don't get lost and you don't find yourself stuck in a place that you can't get out of as far as these practices and these teachings are concerned. And then the other thing that's important is at some point, and I wonder whether those of you who have been coming to the class have at all gotten clear enough to see what I'm about to say. At some point, this work needs to become yours. Right? It's no longer something that you're dependent on the teacher for. It's no longer that you're dependent on the teaching. That at a certain point, through your practice and through the time you spend invested in reading and listening to teaching, you should get to a place where you're clear enough about this that it's your process now. Whether you have if this class discontinues, at some point, right, everything's going to come to an end. Whether the teacher you're involved with or the community you're involved with, that doesn't continue, that you're okay. You can go and continue the process because you're familiar with enough teachers, you're familiar with the teachings, you're familiar with the communities, you know how to practice, and so you should be able to go on with your own at some point. And that's really important because at some point you need to trust your own judgment. At some point you need to trust the awareness that you have come to know yourself as. At some point you have to trust that, know that it can guide you, right? And be open to that guidance. They call it prajna, a wisdom, this wisdom that is a natural part of the awareness, right? At some point, you want to have access to that. You want to be able to consider things that you have to deal with in your life, because life is always throwing stuff at us, right? Yeah, so you want to have enough of a centeredness and enough orientation in the awareness that when things are coming at you in life, right, that you can contemplate what's happening using this wisdom, using this awareness, and then come back and respond to life. Now, what that may mean is that you, in the beginning, you may have to learn to be aware of when reactions are occurring. Don't forget, we don't have anything to say about reactions. You don't have anything to say about emotions. You don't have anything to say about thoughts, right? So when those thoughts and those emotions are reactions, when you get triggered, right, which will continue to happen no matter how awake you are, right? When that happens, it's very important for you to be far enough along in these understandings and practices to recognize when you're triggered, and when you're triggered, do nothing. Pay attention when you're triggered. Just pay attention. And give the system time to process, right? And if you pay attention and do nothing, you'll watch, especially if you've been at this for a while, you'll watch a process occur where you recognize the triggering, right? You pay attention in such a way where the mind can calm down, which means that you start to relax, you come out of the triggered condition, and then you can see a little more clearly than you could see when you're triggered, because when you're triggered, you can't see clearly. Everything narrows down, and you're looking through a very small view of everything, because everything is distorted emotionally, right? When you're angry, if you pay attention when you're angry, you'll see that your attention narrows down very quickly. And all you can think about is angry thoughts. And all you can see is what the anger's telling you is what you're looking at, right? So it's very important to understand when things like that happen, do not take action. That's when you cause trouble. That's when you make big mistakes. When you're in the heat of a reaction, when you're in the heat of an emotion, when you're in the heat of a psychological negative mental process, right? If you act then, the likelihood is your actions are not going to be very effective and probably cause a lot of trouble. And if you've been around for a while, and nobody here is a teenager, if you've been around for a while, you know what I'm talking about, because you've probably done damage. You probably caused trouble like I have, right? Yeah, so what you're learning to do, because it is a system that is a stimulus response system, right? So what you're learning to do is when the stimulus hits and it triggers a reaction and emotions arise and thoughts arise, which you have nothing to say about, okay? So what you're learning in terms of mastery, right? What you're learning is when thoughts arise and emotions arise, do not resist them. Do not resist them. Do not try and control them. Let them be whatever they are, because you have no choice, right? Whatever the feelings are, feel those feelings. Just allow yourself to be aware of the emotions, notice where they are in the body, and feel the feelings. Be aware of the thoughts, right? During that time, you're just paying attention. You're not taking any action. When you do that, when you give that attention, right, the mind starts to calm down, because when you're experiencing awareness of thinking, and when you're experiencing awareness of emotions, the experience of those emotions and those thoughts complete the energetic experience of their existence. When you're experiencing thoughts or emotions, the experiencing of that energy completes the energetic experience of those thoughts and of those emotions. So by doing that, by paying attention and not taking any action, everything will start to calm down. At some point in the calming down, if you're paying attention and you've been practicing long enough, you'll notice you got your vision back. You'll notice you can now see things more realistically. You can now recognize what happened more clearly than you could when you were triggered. And then you can look and see, okay, is there an action that I need to take? Many times there is no action that needs to be taken. And one of the things you learn about being awake is saying nothing and doing nothing can be the most powerful action you can take in many instances. Just think about that. Think about that. Think about when things are going on around you. Somebody's insulting you. Somebody's provoking you, right? Right? If you don't take delivery of those insults, if you don't be provoked, if you don't be insulted, then you're just being present. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to do anything. And it is the case that in many situations when you say nothing or do nothing, the person who is attempting to provoke you, the person who is upset, that wants conflict, right, is left with their own upset. Because you're not upset. They're left with their own upset, right? So whether that's the case or whether when you calm down you see there is an action to take, right? When you calm down and you take that action or you don't take action, you can feel a lot more confident that what you're doing makes sense, that you're connected with reality, and you can take responsibility for your actions. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah. When you don't do that and you are taken by how you feel and you're taken by the thoughts and you identify with the thoughts and you identify with the emotions, right? And you're lost in that and your behavior comes from there, right? Then you have to justify it later because you know goddamn well it doesn't make sense. Then you have to make up excuses. You made me do it, right? You made me angry. You made me do that. You made me hit you. You made me, all that stuff that people do. That's the craziness. That's the craziness. And the reality of it is, people know when they're being crazy, right? That doesn't mean they're going to take responsibility for it, but they know. People know when they're off the hook. People know when they're not making sense. People know when they're acting out. People know when they're allowing their irrational thoughts and their emotions to take over. At the time it's happening, they may have nothing, they may have no control over it, right? But later, that's what remorse is about, that's what guilt is about, right? Because later when you reflect back on it, or later when you see the damage you did, there's no getting around the fact that, you were out of control. You were out of control. So the big thing that this is all about, these practices and these teachings, the big thing that this is all about is being awake. But being awake, from a practical perspective, being awake makes no difference unless it's consistent. Do you get that? Yeah. To be awake for only when you're here, it's a waste of time. What's the point, right? But if you're practicing being awake here, and over time, because of the consistency of that practice, that awakeness starts to become the way you are elsewhere. That awakeness starts to become natural. It starts to be the way you are in your life, right? Then you're able to function consciously and intentionally. Then you're able to take responsibility for the way your life is because you're awake enough to actively participate in it and to take actions that are considered before they're taken, right? And to take actions that are based in being grounded in reality. Knowing who you are, knowing what's real and what's not real. When you act from there, your actions are going to be effective. They're going to be effective. So that's what this is all about. This is about being awake. And the most important understanding in the beginning of this process of being awake and practicing this is to take responsibility for not being awake. That's where you start. The first thing you have to do in order for any of this to make any difference is take responsibility for the condition you're in when you start. And the condition you're in when you start is that you're sleeping. The condition you're in, if you're identified with your thinking and you're identified with your feeling and that's the way you're living your life, you're sleeping. Because the thinking you're doing is like a dream. The feelings you're having are coming from your past experience when the brain gets triggered. It's all automatic. It's all machinery. It's all machinery. So if your life is a life that's given by machinery running, right? You're not really in your life. You're not really in the world. You're living in a world of thinking. Your thinking is the world you're living in. You're living in a world of emotions. Your emotions is the world you're living in. You're not living in the world outside of that or the world beyond that. So it's very important to stay in touch with the bottom line here. You know what I mean? What this is about? What this is about is being awake, being alive, being present, seeing things as they are, being able to respond to life, right? And if you can succeed in all of that, you will have become masterful. That's why the book is called The Master Game. That's why they call people who are awake masters. Yeah, people who are awake, they call them masters. Why? Yeah, because they have the ability to be masterful in the way they're living their life. And that mastery is available to anybody that takes on the challenge of waking up and practicing meditation and learning what the teachings have to tell us. It's available to everybody. So that means it's available to you. But that availability will not produce the result that you would like it to unless you're consistent in terms of your practicing every day, in terms of your continuing to read and listen to teaching. And then, more important than all of that, to apply all that to the situations you find yourself in. Especially the situations that you will find yourself in as time passes and you get older. Yeah, because if you're really smart about it and you understand what we're doing here, you're preparing for death. You're preparing for death. You're preparing for old age. You're preparing for sickness. You're preparing for all of the unpredictable things that life is going to throw at you that you have no idea what they are. You're preparing for all of that. And in the meantime, you're also developing your ability to experience the quality of life that's possible. In other words, be happy, right? The quality of life that's possible. In other words, have peace. The quality of life that's possible. In other words, be able to enjoy the experience of existing and being alive. It's just like they say in that famous phrase from the teachings, Sat Chit Ananda. You ever hear that? Sat Chit Ananda? That's a famous spiritual statement. Sat Chit Ananda. Basically means Sat is existence, Chit is consciousness, Ananda is bliss. Existence, consciousness, bliss. And the reason that's a famous statement is because that's a progression. You know, you exist, then you wake up, then you're happy. Right? That's the same thing as what that says. Existence, consciousness, bliss. Bliss is often misunderstood to mean some, you know, like really high state of, you know, emotionally. But how about the idea that bliss is simply being happy? That's all. And the happiness that we're talking about is not being high or not being joyful. No. The happiness that we're talking about here is the happiness that is a constant experience that's available to anybody who appreciates the fact that they exist. The happiness we're talking about here is a consistent experience that's available for anybody that is aware of the preciousness and the value of their existence. So that kind of happiness is a happiness that you wake up in the morning and it's there. You're not trying to get happy. You know, you're happy first and then you're living your life like that.